On a frozen night, a retired Navy SEAL finds a terrified boy beside a wounded pregnant dog, scars fresh, fear alive, and silence screaming louder than help. The boy runs, the soldier stays, and the dog, bleeding and unbroken, chooses to trust a stranger in the dark. What he discovers next ties the dog to a fallen war hero, and the child to a truth powerful enough to destroy a family. Fire will come, faith will be tested, and one sacrifice will change every life forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Michael Carter had learned to coexist with silence. Not peace, never peace, but the kind of silence that hums beneath the skin, waiting, the sort that followed men home from war and sat with them at night, patient and unblinking. Winter in Bozeman sharpened that silence. Snow swallowed sound until the world felt padded, unreal, as if even memory might freeze if left unattended. At 45, Michael told himself he was retired. The word still felt dishonest. Retirement suggested an ending, and nothing in his body believed the story was over. He lived alone in a small cabin on the edge of town, far enough that neighbors didn't ask questions, close enough that he could still hear a train horn some nights and pretend it was the ocean wind he used to sleep to overseas. He moved through the house by habit, not comfort, checking locks that didn't need checking, sitting where he could see the door, placing objects exactly where his hands expected them to be. He told himself this was discipline. He did not call it fear. The sound came just before midnight. It wasn't loud. That was what made it dangerous, a soft scrape. Then something like a breath pulled too fast through a throat that hurt, the kind of sound the wind tries to steal and fails. Michael stopped moving. The silence changed, tightened, focused. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for stillness, for the skill drilled into him long before bullets ever flew. Listen first, decide later. The sound came again, this time unmistakable, a child, and beneath it, something lower, restrained, vibrating with warning rather than aggression. Michael stepped onto the porch. Cold bit into his lungs, clean and merciless. Snow lay untouched across the yard, smooth as a blank page, except for one frantic mess of footprints near the woodpile. Small shoes, too light. The tracks looped and doubled, as if the person wearing them had tried to run in every direction at once and failed at all of them. "Hey," Michael said, keeping his voice low and even, the way he had spoken to frightened civilians in places where the night carried worse things than cold. "You're safe." The boy stood near the tree line, thin shoulders hunched inside a jacket that didn't quite belong to him. 13, maybe 14. His hands were clenched tight at his sides, knuckles white, as if he didn't trust them not to shake. His eyes darted to Michael's face, then down toward the ground, then back again, calculating, measuring distance, escape routes. Michael recognized that look instantly. It was the look of someone who had learned that hesitation could hurt. Beside him, half hidden by shadow and snow, lay a dog. She did not rise. Michael took one step forward. The dog moved, not much, just enough. A sound rolled out of her chest, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. It was warning shaped by exhaustion. Michael felt it in his bones and stopped immediately. "It's okay," he said, softening his voice, angling his body away to make himself smaller. "I won't touch her." The boy's shoulders sagged, relief flickering there for half a second, before panic slammed back harder. He shook his head, breath coming fast, fogging the air. "I didn't mean to," he said, or maybe he meant something else entirely. The words tangled. "I gotta go." "She's hurt," Michael replied. He didn't move closer. He didn't raise his voice. He knew better than to corner anything already trapped. The boy looked at the dog then, really looked, as if seeing her fully for the first time, or maybe refusing to. His mouth opened, closed. Something like shame crossed his face, raw and unguarded. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he ran. Michael followed for 3 steps before stopping himself. Snow swallowed the boy almost instantly, the way winter erased mistakes without judgment. Chasing him would only teach the wrong lesson. Michael turned back, heart heavy, in a way that felt disturbingly familiar. The dog lay on her side, breath ragged but controlled. Her eyes tracked him with sharp focus, not pleading, not submissive, assessing. Michael knelt slowly, hands visible, letting her see every movement. Blood marked her body in lines that told a story he didn't want to finish reading, welts that spoke of repeated strikes, shallow cuts made by a blade that had wanted to hurt more than kill. She did not cry out. She shifted only enough to curve herself inward, guarding something beneath her. Michael felt his chest tighten. "I see you," he said quietly. Her breath stuttered. Snow melted against her warmth, staining white into red. Michael shrugged out of his jacket and laid it over her without touching skin. She tensed, then slowly settled, accepting the heat. Trust, he knew, was not a gift. It was a negotiation, and she was still deciding whether he deserved a seat at the table. When he lifted her, he was careful, deliberate. She was heavier than she looked, not just in body, but in presence. Responsibility had weight. Inside the garage, the lights hummed awake. Michael set her down on old blankets, his hands moving with the efficiency of muscle memory. Cleaning, binding, assessing. His mind split between past and present, between concrete floors and dusty outposts, between now and the voice of a commander long dead, telling him to protect what couldn't protect itself. A ripple passed through the dog's body, then another. "No," Michael muttered. "Not now." The answer came in the form of a stronger contraction. Understanding hit him hard and fast. She was pregnant. He sat back, snow melting off his boots into a dark ring on the concrete, and let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course she was. The world never tested you once. It tested you until you learned what you were willing to carry. He spoke to her as the night stretched on, about nothing and everything, because silence felt like abandonment. He spoke about the cold, about mountains at dawn, about fear and purpose, and how courage was rarely loud. When the moment came, it came all at once. One small body slid into his hands, warm and impossibly alive. The puppy gasped, then screamed fierce and undeniable, and Michael laughed through shaking breath. There was only one. The dog relaxed in increments, exhaustion flooding her. She nosed the puppy with reverence and curled around it, every instinct screaming protection. Michael leaned back against the wall, trembling, not from cold, but recognition. He had carried wounded men before. He had lost them. He had learned that survival was not fairness. It was timing, chance, and someone choosing to stay when leaving was easier. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing footprints. Inside, a retired soldier watched a battered dog guard her only child like a warrior with nothing left to lose. Michael understood then that the quiet he had built his life around was over. Not because violence had returned, but because responsibility had, and this time he would not walk away. Morning did not bring relief, only clarity, and Michael Carter had learned long ago that clarity could be more dangerous than fear. He sat on the garage floor long after the sun rose, back against the cold wall, watching the dog breathe and the single puppy press closer to her warmth, and something inside him resisted the urge to name what he was feeling, because naming things made them real, and real things demanded action. He told himself he was only keeping them safe until he figured out the next step, but that lie barely lasted a heartbeat. The dog's eyes never fully closed, even in exhaustion, tracking every sound, every shift of air, her attention fixed not on herself, but on the space beyond the door, on threats that no longer stood there, but had carved their shape into her memory. Michael recognized that posture instantly, the way vigilance became a reflex when danger had once come without warning, and he hated how familiar it felt, how easily it mirrored his own nights when sleep had never meant rest. He rose stiffly and moved with care, speaking softly as he cleaned what wounds he could, and when his fingers brushed the worn leather at her neck, he paused, breath catching before he could stop it, because the collar was old in a way that went beyond age, marked by use and intention rather than neglect. He turned it slowly, not expecting anything, and then the name revealed itself, etched shallow but deliberate, the letters uneven as if carved in haste or defiance. Athena. Beneath it, faint but unmistakable, a military symbol he had not seen in years. The room seemed to tilt. Memory did not arrive gently. It came like recoil. Athena. The name dragged him backward through time, through dust and heat and radio static, to a voice that once commanded his respect without raising volume, to a man who believed leadership meant responsibility rather than authority. Colonel James Carter. Not his father by blood, but closer than most men ever came. Michael swallowed, throat tight, because Athena had not just belonged to the unit, she had belonged to the colonel, had worked beside him, had trusted him, and when the colonel died, something inside the team had fractured in a way no after-action report could capture. Michael remembered the day they were told the dog had vanished, presumed dead or taken, remembered how the colonel's absence had hollowed everything that followed, how Michael had left the service not long after, claiming it was time when the truth was simpler and harder to say. He could not stay where ghosts still gave orders. He sat back down, collar heavy in his hands, and the dog shifted, eyes finding him again, and for a moment he wondered if she remembered the colonel too, or if memory for her lived somewhere deeper, in instinct and loss, rather than names and faces. The puppy stirred, making a small sound that cut through his thoughts, and the dog curled closer, exhaustion bowing her head at last, and Michael felt a weight settle that had nothing to do with responsibility and everything to do with recognition. This was not coincidence. This was not random cruelty. Someone had known exactly what they were doing to her. The realization made his jaw tighten. He stood and moved into the kitchen, turning on the radio out of habit rather than interest. The low murmur of local news filling space while he brewed coffee he barely tasted. He did not expect answers. He was not ready for them. The radio crackled through weather updates and traffic reports before a brief segment about a missing person crossed the airwaves, the name barely registered until it was too late to stop the reaction. Robert Brooks. The sound of it sent a ripple through his chest, not recognition exactly, but association, the kind that formed when pieces began aligning without permission. He turned the volume up, listening, as the announcer mentioned an ongoing investigation, details withheld, last known location unspecified. Michael turned the radio off. Too many threads pulled at once. He returned to the garage, crouching beside the dog again, and spoke quietly, not because he thought she understood words, but because silence felt like betrayal. He told her the name on her collar, said it aloud, as if that alone could anchor her to something better than pain, and the dog's ears twitched, her breathing hitching once before steadying, and Michael felt a flicker of certainty that frightened him more than doubt ever had. Names mattered. They carried weight. They demanded acknowledgement. He cleaned the collar carefully and set it aside, then checked the door, the windows, the perimeter, because habits did not break easily, and because part of him suspected the night was not finished with them yet. Hours passed in fragments. The dog slept in short intervals, waking at the slightest sound, and Michael stayed close, pretending his presence was coincidence when it was anything but. He found himself thinking about the boy, the way fear had shaped his movements, the apology whispered like confession, and he wondered what kind of home taught a child to run from help faster than from harm. He did not let himself imagine more. Imagination was a luxury. Instead, he focused on what he could control, on warmth and quiet, and the steady breathing of two lives that depended on him whether he wanted that truth or not. As afternoon light slanted thin and pale across the snow, a car slowed on the road outside, tires crunching deliberately, and Michael stilled, heart rate shifting without conscious command. The car did not stop. It continued on. But the moment lingered, sharp and unresolved, and Michael knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the past had found him not by accident, and whatever came next would not ask whether he was ready. The knock was hesitant, almost apologetic, and Michael recognized it before he reached the door, the rhythm of someone who feared what waited on the other side more than what chased them from behind. He did not call out. He did not ask who it was. He opened the door slowly, ready for anything, and found the boy standing there again, shoulders hunched against the cold, eyes lowered as if the snow itself might accuse him. Ethan Brooks looked smaller in daylight, not younger, but diminished, as though something essential had been pressed down too many times. His hands were wrapped in thin bandages, already stained through, fingers swollen and stiff, and Michael understood without being told that the wounds were not accidents and not old. The boy flinched when the door creaked, then steadied himself, jaw tightening with a resolve that felt borrowed rather than owned. Michael stepped aside without a word, and Ethan entered, gaze darting instinctively toward corners, exits, shadows, cataloging risk with the efficiency of someone who had learned the cost of missing details. Inside, the air was warm and quiet, too quiet. Ethan froze when he saw the dog lying near the garage entrance, her body curved protectively around the small life pressed against her. For a moment, fear flashed across his face, sharp and instinctive, but it did not turn into flight this time. Instead, it collapsed into something heavier. Guilt. He swallowed hard, eyes shining, and Michael watched the internal battle play out in silence, recognizing it for what it was because he had fought the same war himself in different rooms, different years. "I didn't know where else to go," Ethan said finally, voice hoarse, each word dragged out as if it resisted leaving him. Michael nodded once. He did not ask questions yet. He understood that timing mattered. Ethan shifted his weight, pain flickering across his expression as his injured hands protested, and Michael gestured for him to sit. When Ethan hesitated, Michael pulled a chair back himself, slow and deliberate, showing rather than telling that nothing here would strike him for taking space. The words came in fragments at first, disordered and sharp, memories colliding rather than lining up. Ethan spoke of his father, Robert Brooks, without using his name at first, as if naming him might summon consequences. He spoke of rules that changed daily, of silence that was safer than truth, of nights where anger arrived without warning, and left marks meant to teach obedience rather than heal. Michael listened without interruption, jaw tight, hands clenched just enough to remind himself where he was. He had interrogated enemy combatants before, but this was not interrogation. This was extraction, slow and careful, pulling truth out without tearing the person it was attached to. Ethan's hands trembled as he lifted them, showing the bruising beneath the bandages, and Michael felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, the kind that once pushed him toward violence in places where violence had been the only language spoken. He forced it down. This was different. This required restraint. Ethan's voice steadied when he spoke about the dog. He said her name this time, Athena, and something in his posture softened even as his eyes filled. He explained how she had been brought to their property months ago, how she never broke the way the others did, never learned to lower her head or stop watching. He said his father wanted money, leverage, control, and that Athena was valuable because of what she was and where she came from. When Ethan described the punishment, his hands curled unconsciously, fingers stiff, with remembered pain, and Michael understood that the boy's scars and the dog's wounds were chapters of the same story, written by the same hand. Ethan reached into his jacket then, movements careful, as if afraid the truth itself might bite, and pulled out a small, battered phone. He did not hand it over immediately. He looked at Michael instead, searching his face with desperate precision, measuring whether trust would be returned or used against him. Michael met his gaze and did not look away. Ethan nodded once and passed the phone across. The videos were short and badly framed, recorded in secret, always at a distance. Michael watched without comment as images flickered past, enough to establish pattern, if not detail. He did not need more. He had learned long ago that evil rarely announced itself clearly. It revealed itself in repetition. When the screen went dark, Ethan exhaled shakily, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. "He'll know I came here," he said quietly. "He always knows." Michael considered the words, the fear beneath them, and felt the weight of responsibility shift again, heavier now, because it was undeniable. He glanced toward Athena, still vigilant even in rest, her attention never straying far from the door, and then back to Ethan, whose shoulders had begun to sag with exhaustion that no child should carry. "You're safe here," Michael said, and meant it in a way that went beyond reassurance. It was a promise, one he understood the cost of making. Ethan nodded, though disbelief lingered at the edges of his expression, and Michael did not blame him. Trust was not restored by words. It was rebuilt by consistency, by mornings that did not bring punishment, by nights that stayed quiet. Outside the light faded, snow beginning to fall again, soft and relentless, and Michael knew that the boy's return had changed the shape of everything. He had thought the night before was the beginning. He understood now it had only been the invitation. Winter tightens around Bozeman as law and fear meet under fluorescent lights. Snow piles against courthouse steps while Michael Carter learns that truth alone is not enough when a child's terror refuses to let him speak. The courthouse smelled of disinfectant and old paper, a sterile attempt at order that never quite erased the human residue of fear and hope soaked into its walls. And Michael Carter felt the familiar tightening in his chest as he crossed the threshold. Not from hostility, but from memory, because buildings like this had always been where stories were decided by people who rarely carried their consequences home. He kept his pace measured, eyes forward, Ethan Brooks walking beside him with steps too careful for a boy his age, as if every tile might crack beneath the wrong weight. Michael could feel the child's tension without looking, the way it radiated outward, sharp and uncontained, and it reminded him of young soldiers on their first deployment, trying to appear steady while their bodies betrayed them. They stopped near the doors of the small hearing room, and Michael placed a hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder, not gripping, not restraining, just present. And Ethan flinched before forcing himself still, shame flashing across his face at the instinctive reaction. Michael said nothing. Some things could not be corrected by reassurance. Laura Carter found them there, a slim folder tucked under her arm, her expression composed in the way prosecutors learned early, a practiced calm that did not mean detachment so much as survival. She was Michael's niece, though the resemblance was less physical than internal, a shared stubbornness that came from the same family fractures, and she had chosen her work deliberately, gravitating toward cases involving children and animals, because she believed the law should protect those without power rather than reward those skilled at hiding cruelty behind procedure. She greeted Michael quietly, acknowledging Ethan with a gentle nod that carried no expectation, no demand, and Michael felt a flicker of gratitude for that restraint. Laura knew the evidence was strong enough to initiate proceedings, knew that records, videos, and patterns could build a case against Robert Brooks, but she also knew what Michael understood instinctively, that without a living witness willing to speak, the truth could still be bent into something unrecognizable. Inside the hearing room, the atmosphere was subdued, stripped of spectacle, and yet the stakes felt heavier for its simplicity. Michael took a seat behind Ethan, close enough that the boy could sense him there without feeling crowded, while Laura moved to her place with deliberate efficiency. When Robert Brooks entered, flanked by his attorney, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. Michael watched Ethan's posture collapse inward, shoulders rounding as if bracing for a blow that might arrive at any moment. Brooks did not look at his son at first. When he did, the glance was brief, calculating, and something in it made Michael's jaw tighten. He recognized the look not as anger, but as ownership, the silent assertion that whatever sat in front of Brooks belonged to him, regardless of walls or witnesses. The hearing began with formalities, words exchanged that felt distant from the reality Michael had seen etched into Ethan's hands and Athena's wounds. Laura spoke clearly, outlining the evidence gathered so far, her voice steady, precise. And Michael listened not just to what she said, but to how she said it, careful not to promise what the law might fail to deliver. When the moment came for Ethan to be called forward, the room seemed to hold its breath. Michael felt the shift instantly, felt the boy stiffen, as if every muscle had been wired to the same alarm. Ethan stood halfway, then froze, eyes fixed on the floor, breath coming shallow and fast. Michael leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear, telling him it was all right, that nothing would happen if he couldn't do it today. And yet, even as he spoke, he knew reassurance alone would not loosen fear that had been trained into place over years. Ethan's gaze flicked up, met his father's for a fraction of a second, and whatever fragile resolve he had gathered, fractured. He shook his head once, small and decisive, and sank back into his chair. The silence that followed was not dramatic, not loud, but it was heavy with disappointment and something close to collective guilt, because everyone in that room understood what had just happened and what it meant. Laura did not push. She signaled the pause, accepting the reality of the moment rather than forcing a performance that would only harm the witness further. The judge acknowledged the request, voice neutral, and Michael felt a complicated mix of relief and frustration settle into his bones. He was relieved that Ethan had not been pushed beyond what he could bear, frustrated because he knew how easily hesitation could be weaponized by those who thrived on it. As the room began to empty, Michael stayed seated, giving Ethan time to breathe, to orient himself, to understand that fear did not erase his worth. Robert Brooks passed them on his way out, close enough that Michael could smell cologne and arrogance in equal measure. And the man paused just long enough to lean in slightly, his voice low, carrying a familiarity that made Michael's skin crawl. "You should have stayed out of this," Brooks murmured, not looking at Ethan, but at Michael, as if the boy were an extension of property, rather than a person. Michael met his gaze without blinking, the stillness of his expression not a challenge but a warning, and Brooks smiled thinly before moving on, confident, unbothered, as though the outcome were already written. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting down with deceptive calm, and Ethan's breathing gradually slowed as they stepped into the cold. He apologized then, the words spilling out of him, as if he had been holding it back with the same effort he had used to remain silent. Michael stopped him gently, turning so they stood face to face, and told him that survival was not failure, that there would be another moment, another chance, and that courage did not always announce itself on schedule. Ethan nodded, though doubt lingered, and Michael understood that the boy's fear was not weakness, but conditioning, the residue of a life where speaking had always made things worse. That night, back at the cabin, Michael watched Athena closely as she rested near her puppy, noting the way her attention sharpened whenever a car passed on the road, the way she positioned herself instinctively between the door and what she protected. He saw the parallel with Ethan and felt a quiet resolve take shape, not loud or dramatic, but firm. He could not force either of them to confront what terrified them most, but he could create a space where fear no longer dictated every outcome. As he turned off the lights and settled into the chair he had not intended to use for sleeping, Michael realized that the hearing had not failed. It had revealed exactly how deep the damage ran, and in doing so, it had clarified what would be required next. Somewhere between law and loyalty, between patience and urgency, a line was forming, and Michael knew that when the time came, someone would have to step across it first. Winter holds Bozeman in a brittle pause. Snow clings to the ground as if waiting for a decision, while inside one small room, fear is weighed against truth, and a boy stands on the edge of choosing his own voice. Michael Carter understood waiting better than most people understood action. Waiting had been the longest part of war, the space where fear rehearsed every possible ending, and discipline was the only thing that kept it from winning. In the days after the failed hearing, he watched Ethan Brooks move through the cabin like someone testing new gravity, careful, uncertain, flinching less often but never fully relaxed. Michael did not push. He cooked meals, fixed a loose board on the porch, talked about ordinary things that carried no consequences, because he knew from experience that courage could not be demanded, only invited. At night, when the house settled and the wind traced its fingers along the walls, Ethan sometimes sat at the table staring at nothing, hands curled inward, and Michael recognized the look of someone replaying memories they could not yet speak aloud. He did not interrupt those moments. He simply stayed nearby, present in a way that did not ask for repayment. Laura Carter returned often, never with urgency, never with pressure. She brought updates framed carefully, explaining how evidence accumulated like weight rather than striking like lightning. Financial records, patterns of injury, corroborating statements from places Ethan's father had assumed would never connect. She spoke plainly, respecting Ethan enough to tell him the truth without dramatizing it, and Michael saw the effect slowly take shape. Fear thrives in isolation, but understanding gave Ethan something solid to push against. One evening, after Laura left, Ethan asked a question so quietly Michael almost missed it. "If I talk," he said, eyes fixed on the floor, "does it end?" Michael considered the question seriously before answering, because lies were easy and useless. He told Ethan that it might not end everything, that some echoes lasted longer than justice, but that silence guaranteed nothing would change. He told him that standing up did not erase the past, but it could stop it from owning the future. Ethan nodded, absorbing the words as if testing their weight. The night before the rescheduled hearing, Michael slept in the chair again, not because he feared nightmares, but because he wanted to be awake if Ethan needed him. He listened to the rhythm of the house and to Athena's quiet vigilance near her puppy, noting how the dog's attention never fully softened, how protection had become instinct rather than choice. The parallel was not lost on him. Both the boy and the dog had learned the same lesson from pain. Survival required readiness. Michael wondered if either of them would ever unlearn it, or if healing simply meant learning when it was safe to stand down. Morning arrived pale and cold. Ethan dressed without being told, movements deliberate, hands steady, despite the faint tremor that betrayed his nerves. On the drive to the courthouse, neither of them spoke. Words felt unnecessary and fragile. Michael focused on the road, on the familiar pressure of responsibility settling into place, and thought of his old commander, of the quiet certainty with which that man had once walked into rooms far more dangerous than this. He did not believe in destiny, but he believed in moments that tested who you were willing to be. The courtroom was fuller this time, the air charged with expectation rather than procedure. Michael took his place behind Ethan, close enough to anchor, but not crowd, while Laura organized her notes with calm efficiency. When Robert Brooks entered, the same confidence hung around him, the same assumption of control, but Michael noticed something new in Ethan's posture. The boy stiffened, yes, but he did not fold. His gaze lifted, not to meet his father's eyes, but to look straight ahead, as if refusing to let the past dictate the present. When his name was called, the room seemed to narrow, sound dulling at the edges, and Michael felt the instinctive urge to stand, to intervene, to shield. He stayed seated. This was not his moment to take. Ethan stood. The movement was small, but the impact was not. He walked to the front with careful steps, breath shallow but controlled, and when he began to speak, his voice wavered only once before steadying. He spoke of rules that changed without warning, of punishment that arrived disguised as discipline, of nights spent listening for footsteps and learning which silences were dangerous. He spoke of Athena, of how she had never learned to submit, of how that refusal had cost her, and his words gathered strength as he went, as if truth itself were lending him support. Michael watched the transformation with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that courage did not come without cost. Laura guided gently, asking only what was necessary, letting Ethan set the pace, and when the defense attempted to undermine him, Michael saw the shift clearly. The room no longer belonged to the man who had relied on fear. It belonged to the boy who had survived it. When Ethan finished, he did not look at his father. He returned to his seat and exhaled as if releasing a weight he had carried too long. The remainder of the hearing unfolded with a momentum that surprised no one paying attention. Evidence aligned. Patterns emerged. The law, slow and imperfect, finally found its footing. When the decision was announced, the words felt almost anticlimactic in their simplicity. Guilty. Michael felt the tension drain from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet exhaustion that came not from relief alone, but from the recognition of how close the outcome had been to something else entirely. Outside, snow fell steadily, indifferent to verdicts and human reckoning. Ethan stood beside Michael on the courthouse steps, the cold biting into his cheeks, and for the first time since they had met, he smiled without checking his surroundings. It was not a wide smile, not careless, but it was real. Michael returned it with a nod rather than words, because words would only dilute the moment. As they walked back to the car, Michael felt a cautious hope take root, tempered by experience, but undeniable. He knew better than to believe the fight was over, knew that consequences rippled outward in unpredictable ways, but he also knew that something fundamental had shifted. Ethan had chosen to speak. The past no longer owned the only narrative. That knowledge followed Michael home, settling into the quiet, and as night approached once more, he sensed, without yet understanding how, that the cost of that choice had not finished revealing itself. Night returns hard and unforgiving to Bozeman. Snow falls thick and fast as distance, and seconds begin to matter, and a single news bulletin turns an ordinary errand into a race against fire and regret. Michael Carter did not think of danger when he left the cabin that evening, only of routine, of milk and batteries, and the small habits that helped life pretend it was normal again. And he told himself that leaving Ethan Brooks inside with Athena and her puppy was safe because the house was warm, the doors were locked, and the past had already been judged. That was the lie he did not realize he was telling. He drove into town beneath heavy snow, windshield wipers struggling to keep pace, radio murmuring low and forgettable until the tone shifted, the announcer's voice tightening with urgency, and Michael's hand froze on the steering wheel as the words cut through the static. Robert Brooks had escaped custody during a transfer. Details were unclear. Authorities advised caution. Michael did not wait to hear more. His body reacted before his mind could argue, adrenaline sharp and familiar, the same instinct that had once turned noise into threat and silence into warning. He turned the truck around too fast, tires slipping, heart hammering not with fear for himself, but with a colder, heavier dread for what he had left behind. As he drove, images crowded his thoughts without invitation. Ethan standing in the courtroom, voice shaking but unbroken. Athena curled protectively around her puppy. the thin line of confidence that had only just begun to form. Michael pushed the accelerator harder, knowing even as he did that speed was not control, that time did not bargain, but refusing to surrender the illusion that effort could still change outcomes. Snow thickened, visibility shrinking, the road narrowing into something almost unreal. And then he saw it, a smear of orange against the dark sky where no light should have been, flickering, growing, unmistakable. Fire. The truck skidded to a stop before the cabin, heat already pressing outward in waves that mocked the cold, flames clawing up the walls with greedy certainty. Smoke rolled thick and black, carrying with it the sound that shattered what remained of Michael's composure, a child screaming. Ethan's voice, raw and desperate, cutting through the roar of burning wood, and Michael ran. He did not remember opening the door, did not remember shouting Ethan's name until his throat burned, only the sensation of heat and the weight of failure slamming into him with every step. Inside, chaos reigned. Smoke choked the air, visibility collapsing into fragments, and through it all, Michael could hear Ethan, closer now, trapped somewhere beyond the reach of his hands. Athena moved through the haze with purpose. Her presence felt more than seen, positioning herself between flame and life, instincts sharpened by a history that had taught her what fire and men could do. Michael lunged forward, coughing, eyes streaming, shouting directions he did not know if anyone could hear. And then another figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the blaze. Robert Brooks stood there, face stripped of arrogance and calculation, replaced by something naked and unguarded that Michael had never seen on him before. Shock, recognition, and beneath it all, terror. For a moment, Robert did not move. He stared into the inferno as if trying to convince himself it was not real, as if denial might still save him from choice. Then Ethan screamed again, and the sound broke through whatever armor Robert had worn for years. His body reacted with a violence that surprised even him, turning, running, plunging into the fire with no plan beyond instinct. Michael shouted after him, warning, cursing, but the words were swallowed by heat and smoke. Inside, everything collapsed into urgency. Michael forced his way deeper, guided by sound rather than sight, pain flaring across his skin as embers fell, and through it all he saw Athena, low and determined, shielding Ethan and her puppy with her own body, refusing to retreat even as the flames advanced. Robert reached them first, hands shaking, grabbing Ethan and pulling him close, coughing, sobbing, words breaking apart before they could become apology or explanation. Michael reached them seconds later, grabbing the puppy, shouting over the roar that they had to move now, that the roof would not wait for decisions. They staggered toward the exit, the house protesting with sharp cracks and falling debris, and Michael felt a brief, savage relief as cold air hit his lungs, as Ethan's screams turned into gasping breaths as the puppy squirmed alive in his arms. Behind them the fire surged, and Athena did not follow. Michael turned back instinctively, heart lurching, seeing her hesitate for the first time, trapped by falling timber and flame that blocked every path. He shouted her name without thinking, voice breaking, and for a moment her eyes met his through the smoke, not panicked, not pleading, but steady, resolute, as if this ending had always been part of her understanding of protection. The heat forced Michael back, hands burning, lungs screaming, and then the structure collapsed inward with a sound that felt final. Snow fell harder, hissing against flame, indifferent to loss. Ethan clung to Robert, shaking, alive. The puppy whimpered softly, warm against Michael's chest. Sirens wailed in the distance, too late for what mattered most. Michael dropped to his knees in the snow, breath tearing out of him, watching the place he had tried to make safe burn down to memory. Robert Brooks knelt a few feet away, staring at the fire with hollow eyes, hands stained with soot and blood, the weight of what he had almost lost, crashing down on him without mercy. Michael did not know what he felt in that moment toward the man. There was no room for hatred, Only exhaustion, grief, and the terrible clarity that sometimes redemption arrived too late to save everyone. As the flames consumed the last standing beam, Michael realized that Athena had made her choice without hesitation, and that choice had saved a child and a future at the cost of her own. The knowledge settled like ash, heavy and inescapable, and as the sirens drew closer, Michael understood that this night would not end with the fire. It would only begin what came next. Snow smothers the ruins outside Bozeman as fire dies into smoke. Sirens cut the night, and among ash and breath, a final reckoning unfolds where love, guilt, and sacrifice decide what survives the flames. The fire receded the way storms always did, not with apology, but with exhaustion, leaving behind a silence heavier than the night that had birthed it. And Michael Carter stood in the snow, struggling to accept that the heat was gone, but the loss had settled permanently into his bones. He held the puppy close, feeling the small, insistent pulse of life against his chest, while Ethan Brooks knelt nearby coughing and shaking, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and something like relief. Robert Brooks was on his knees a short distance away, hands cuffed now, soot streaked across his skin, staring at the blackened skeleton of the house with an expression Michael could not immediately name, because it was not rage or defiance or even fear, but the hollow aftermath of realization, the look of a man who had crossed too many lines to retreat and finally understood what one of those crossings had cost him. Michael watched emergency lights paint the snow red and blue and thought of Athena, of the way she had met his gaze through smoke without panic, of how she had chosen stillness over escape because protection for her had never been a calculation but an instinct refined by years of pain and duty. He felt the grief arrive fully then, sharp and unyielding, because he knew that if he allowed himself to pretend she might somehow have survived, he would be denying the meaning of what she had done. Athena had not been trapped by chance. She had stayed. That distinction mattered. As firefighters moved through the ruins, calling out measurements and hazards, Michael did not interfere, did not argue, did not demand miracles, because this was not a battlefield where rage could change outcomes. This was aftermath, and aftermath required witness rather than resistance. He knelt beside Ethan, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, and felt the tension there gradually release, felt the child lean into that contact, as if finally understanding that the danger had passed. Ethan's eyes were fixed on the place where Athena had disappeared, confusion and grief colliding in his expression, and Michael knew that loss would carve itself into the boy in ways neither of them could yet predict. But he also knew that loss did not have to define him the way fear once had. Robert Brooks was lifted to his feet by officers then, his gaze flicking briefly toward Ethan, not with command or expectation this time, but with something close to regret, and Michael saw the truth of it without satisfaction. Whatever redemption Robert might cling to would be measured not by that one act of turning back into the fire, but by the years he would spend facing the consequences of everything that had come before it. The law moved efficiently after that, statements taken, timelines established, charges expanded, and Robert Brooks disappeared into the back of a patrol car, his fate no longer uncertain, but sealed by his own choices. Dawn arrived quietly, pale light creeping over scorched ground, and Michael felt the night's violence recede into something he could finally hold without being consumed by it. In the days that followed, the world insisted on continuing. Temporary housing was arranged, inquiries made, condolences offered by people who did not know what words to use, and tried anyway. Ethan stayed close to Michael, sleep coming in short bursts, but returning more easily each night, the constant vigilance loosening its grip now that no footsteps waited outside his door. The puppy thrived despite the chaos, eating eagerly, pressing into warmth without hesitation, and Michael found himself watching it with a mixture of wonder and sorrow, because life persisted not as denial of loss, but as response to it. When the court finalized Robert Brooks's sentence, there was no spectacle, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice, however delayed or imperfect, had been carried out, and Michael felt neither triumph nor closure, only a solemn acceptance that some endings were meant to be endured rather than celebrated. The question of Ethan's future arose naturally after that, not as debate, but as inevitability, and when the paperwork was completed and signatures dried, Michael found himself standing beside the boy outside a modest office, realizing that family had formed not through blood, but through shared survival. That night, back where the cabin once stood, Michael placed a simple marker in the snow, not to memorialize the structure, but to acknowledge the sacrifice that had given everything else a chance. He spoke Athena's name aloud once, steady and clear, and the puppy stirred at the sound, lifting its head as if responding to something older than memory. Michael did not imagine spirits or miracles, but he believed in continuity, in the way courage imprinted itself across generations, in the way one life could shape another long after it was gone. As winter deepened and days shortened, Michael and Ethan built routines from small, deliberate choices, meals shared, silences respected, trust rebuilt, not through promises, but through consistency. The puppy grew stronger, confident without cruelty, alert without fear, and Michael saw in it a quiet echo of Athena's unyielding resolve, not as replacement, but as inheritance. On the first clear morning after the snow finally eased, Michael stood outside with Ethan and the dog, watching sunlight catch on untouched white fields, and understood that the story had reached its end not because pain had vanished, but because meaning had taken its place. Athena was gone. Robert Brooks was held to account. A child was safe. A soldier had found a reason to stay. And from loss, something honest had been built, not perfect, not untouched, but real. And for the first time in years, Michael Carter did not feel the need to listen for the past in the quiet, because the quiet no longer belonged to it. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or light, but as quiet courage placed in ordinary hands. Sometimes God does not stop the fire, but sends the strength to walk into it for someone else. In our daily lives, we may never face flames like these, yet we are tested in smaller ways every day, when we choose compassion over fear, truth over silence, and love over comfort. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that no act of kindness is ever wasted, and no sacrifice is unseen by God. Carry that light into your own life. Share this story with someone who needs hope, leave a comment with your thoughts or a prayer, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that honor courage, redemption, and faith. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and guide your steps today and always.